Ashton, I never wanted to hurt you.
But you did. You chose to betray me with my own brother, just like in real infidelity stories.
It wasn't like that. I didn't plan for it to happen.
Spare me the excuses. You let him into our home, into our lives.
I was lonely. You were never around.
And that justifies cheating?
No, but I felt invisible to you.
Invisible? Or just unwilling to see what was right in front of you?
I know I messed up, but I want to fix this.
Fix what? The trust? The love?
I'll do anything. Just tell me you're willing to try.
You think it's that easy?
I don't want to lose you. Not like this.
You've already lost me.
No, please. I can change. We can change.
Can we? Or are we just pretending?
I swear, I'll fight for us. Just give me a sign that you're still in this.
A sign? You think I need a sign?
What do you need then?
What if I told you I'm not the only one who's been keeping secrets?
What do you mean?
You really don't know everything, do you?
Ashton, what are you saying?
You might want to consider what you've unleashed. Brandon, Ashton's younger brother, was the polar opposite. At 22, he was vibrant, carefree, and full of life. When he moved into their guest room for a few months to save money while job hunting, Julia initially viewed him as a guest to be managed. However, Brandon's easy charm soon disrupted her routine. He offered unsolicited help with groceries, joked about her culinary skills, and genuinely seemed interested in her thoughts. Julia couldn't help but smile at his youthful energy. One evening, as Ashton worked late yet again, Julia found herself sharing a cup of tea with Brandon in the garden. He opened up about feeling overshadowed by his older brother, the family's golden child. For the first time in ages, Julia felt someone understood her struggles. She confided in him about her loneliness and how she felt like an afterthought in her own marriage. Brandon listened intently, his empathy creating an unspoken connection between them. For Julia, it was the first time in years that someone saw her for who she was, not just a wife or homemaker. Neither of them realized it yet, but this moment was the beginning of something they couldn't yet define, something that would challenge everything they held sacred. As Brandon settled into their home, he became a welcome distraction for Julia, bringing laughter back into her life. His humor and youthful perspective filled the quiet house, teasing her about her love for gardening and her organization skills. One afternoon, while cleaning the attic, they discovered an old photo album. Flipping through memories of Ashton and Brandon's childhood, Julia laughed at Brandon's mischievous stories, beginning to see him as more than just her brother-in-law. Their conversations deepened, sharing secrets and frustrations. Julia confided about her failing marriage, while Brandon revealed his insecurities about living up to his brother's success. This vulnerability forged an unexpected bond, though Julia felt a twinge of guilt, reminding herself their interactions were innocent. Brandon found subtle ways to spend more time with her, lingering in the kitchen and offering compliments that flattered her. Julia began to change too, putting more effort into her appearance, enjoying Brandon's lingering glances. One evening, while watching a movie during Ashton's business trip, the tension between them grew. Their hands brushed while reaching for popcorn, and an awkward silence fell. Julia laughed it off, but her heart raced, and Brandon seemed equally flustered, signaling that their friendship was blurring into something more. From that moment, their dynamic shifted. The casual banter took on a more playful tone, laced with subtle flirtation. Brandon started texting Julia during the day, sending memes or asking about her day. Julia found herself checking her phone more frequently, eagerly awaiting his messages. Still, she clung to the idea that their interactions were innocent, a mindset commonly seen in a wife infidelity story. She told herself that Brandon was simply filling a void in her life that Ashton had left. But the way her heart fluttered whenever Brandon smiled at her suggested otherwise. Without realizing it, they were inching closer to a line that, once crossed, could never be undone. The flirtation between Julia and Brandon continued to intensify, yet neither of them openly acknowledged it. They lived in a state of unspoken tension, each aware of the growing connection but unwilling to admit it. The turning point came one afternoon when Brandon offered to help Julia rearrange the living room furniture. What started as a practical task turned into a playful tug-of-war over a heavy armchair. Laughing and out of breath, they collapsed onto the couch together. For a moment, the room was filled with nothing but the sound of their breathing. Brandon looked at Julia, his eyes lingering a second too long. He reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, and Julia froze. She felt her pulse quicken as she met his gaze, a mix of fear and anticipation flooding her senses. The moment was interrupted by the sound of Ashton's car pulling into the driveway. Julia jumped to her feet, her heart pounding. "We should finish up," she mumbled, avoiding Brandon's eyes. But the damage was done. Both knew the dynamic between them had shifted irreversibly. Over the next few days, Julia found herself replaying that moment in her mind. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself it was a fleeting lapse in judgment. But every time she saw Brandon, the tension was palpable. Brandon, for his part, seemed emboldened by the encounter. He found excuses to touch her, a hand on her back as he passed by, a brush of his fingers when handing her a glass of water. Julia knew they were dangerously close to crossing a line, yet a part of her didn't want to stop. The attention Brandon gave her was intoxicating, a reminder of the woman she used to be before life became so routine. The night the line was crossed started like any other. Ashton had called to say he'd be working late, leaving Julia and Brandon alone for dinner. They ate in silence at first, the tension between them heavier than ever. Finally, Brandon broke the quiet with a joke, and Julia couldn't help but laugh. It felt good to laugh, to forget, if only for a moment, the complicated emotion swirling inside her. After dinner, they moved to the living room. Julia poured herself a glass of wine and offered one to Brandon. The conversation started innocently enough, but as the evening wore on, the atmosphere grew charged. Brandon, emboldened by the wine, moved closer to Julia on the couch. "You're amazing, you know that," he said softly, his voice sincere. "Ashton's lucky to have you." Julia looked at him, her heart pounding. "I don't feel amazing," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Before she could say anything more, Brandon leaned in, his lips brushing hers. Julia's first instinct was to pull away, but the longing she'd suppressed for so long took over. The kiss deepened, and in that moment, all the reasons why it was wrong seemed to disappear. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. "We can't," Julia began, but the words felt hollow. Brandon simply nodded, but neither of them moved. That night, their connection crossed into forbidden territory, much like the turning point in a cheating wife story, and there was no going back. Julia lay awake in bed later, guilt and exhilaration battling within her. She knew she should feel ashamed, but instead, she felt alive for the first time in years. Little did she know, the choices made that night would set off a chain of events that would change their lives forever. In the days following that fateful night, Julia and Brandon found themselves caught in a whirlwind of emotions. Their stolen moments together became increasingly bold, a lingering touch in the hallway, secretive smiles during meals, and whispered conversations in the quiet corners of the house, all fed the flames of their growing affair. The thrill of their forbidden connection was intoxicating, yet it came with an undercurrent of fear. Julia found herself more alive than she had been in years. Brandon's attention made her feel desired and appreciated in a way she hadn't felt since the early days of her marriage. He spoke to her with a tenderness that reignited a spark within her. With exhilaration came guilt. Every time Ashton came home exhausted and kissed Julia, she felt a pang of remorse. She tried to blame Ashton's neglect for her actions, but the excuse felt hollow. Brandon, deeply infatuated with Julia, began to feel the weight of their secret. He avoided calls from their parents, fearing they'd sense something was off, and left the house for hours to clear his head. Yet, the pull toward Julia was irresistible. Their affair continued in secrecy, each encounter more passionate than the last, but the risk of discovery loomed. Julia became hyper-aware of Ashton's schedule to keep their moments hidden. Brandon grew anxious, but couldn't end things. The thrill was too addictive, and their feelings too real. They both knew their actions were unsustainable, and the truth would eventually surface, with devastating consequences. As weeks passed, their secret became harder to conceal. The stress took a toll on Julia, making her defensive and irritable. Ashton, oblivious, attributed her mood to frustration with his long hours and decided to reconnect. He surprised Julia with plans for a weekend getaway, saying, "We need this." Torn between guilt and hope for their marriage, she agreed, though leaving Brandon behind ached her heart. During the trip, Ashton opened up, admitting his focus on work was to provide a secure future. His words struck a chord, making Julia realize how distant they had grown. Meanwhile, Brandon was left alone, consumed by guilt and longing, questioning whether their affair was worth the damage it could cause. The cracks in their facade were widening, and both Julia and Brandon knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The affair came to an abrupt and devastating end one afternoon when Ashton returned home earlier than expected, reminiscent of real infidelity stories. He was eager to surprise Julia with flowers, a gesture of love inspired by their weekend trip. As he entered the house, he heard soft laughter coming from the living room. Curious, he followed the sound and froze in the doorway. Julia and Brandon were sitting close on the couch, their heads bent together in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. When Julia looked up and saw Ashton standing there, the color drained from her face. "Ashton," she began, but he held up a hand to silence her. The confrontation that followed was explosive. Ashton demanded the truth, and Julia, unable to deny it any longer, confessed. Brandon tried to take responsibility, admitting his role and apologizing profusely, but Ashton was inconsolable. The betrayal cut deeply, not just as a husband, but as a brother. Ashton's heartbreak was evident as he ordered both Julia and Brandon to leave the house. Julia pleaded with him, trying to explain how neglected she'd felt, but her words only seemed to deepen his pain. "I trusted you," he said, his voice trembling with anger and hurt. Both of them packed their bags that evening and left. Julia found herself moving in with a friend while she tried to make sense of her choices. The household was shattered, and the damage to their relationship seemed irreparable. The truth was out, and there was no going back. In the weeks following the revelation, the fallout was felt by everyone involved. Julia, now living away from Ashton, was forced to confront the reality of her actions. She began therapy to understand why she had allowed herself to cross such a devastating line, a journey familiar to many in a wife infidelity story. Through painful self-reflection, she realized that her feelings of neglect had blinded her to the damage she was causing. Brandon returned to his parents' home, where he faced the judgment of his family. Though he didn't reveal the full extent of what had happened, his parents sensed something was wrong. He struggled to regain his sense of self, haunted by the knowledge that he had betrayed his brother's trust. Ashton, meanwhile, was left to pick up the pieces of his life. Though he was deeply hurt, he tried to focus on his work and his own healing. Friends and family rallied around him, offering support, but the betrayal weighed heavily on his heart. Julia reached out to Ashton several times, but he remained distant. She wrote him a letter, sincerely apologizing and expressing her hope that he could one day forgive her. "I know I've caused you unimaginable pain," she wrote, "but I hope you can find peace, whether or not I'm part of your life." Brandon too wrote to Ashton, admitting his mistakes and asking for forgiveness. He promised to work on himself and rebuild the trust he had broken. The wounds were deep, and healing seemed like a distant possibility. Yet each of them began to take small steps toward rebuilding their lives. Months later, Julia and Ashton met in a small cafe to discuss the practicalities of their separation. It was the first time they'd seen each other since the affair was revealed. Ashton, though still hurt, seemed calmer and more composed. Julia too had changed. Therapy had helped her understand the root of her unhappiness, and she was determined to take accountability for her actions. "I'm sorry," Julia said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Not just for what I did, but for not fighting harder for us before it came to this." Ashton nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "I loved you, Julia. I still do in some way, but trust is something I don't know if we can rebuild." Their conversation ended amicably, though it was clear their paths were diverging. Julia left the cafe with a heavy heart, but a newfound determination to rebuild her life, as often seen in a cheating wife story. She vowed to learn from her mistakes and never let her emotions lead her to such destructive choices again. Brandon, on the other hand, was still working to repair his relationship with Ashton. Though they hadn't spoken directly, he sent Ashton a heartfelt letter expressing his regret and hope for reconciliation. It would take time, but Brandon was committed to earning back his brother's trust. The story ended not with a neat resolution, but with a lesson: the importance of communication, boundaries, and self-awareness in relationships. Julia and Brandon's choices had caused irreparable harm, but they also served as a painful reminder that true connection requires honesty and effort. As Julia stood at the crossroads of her life, she realized that her journey was just beginning. Her story, much like countless others in the realm of wife infidelity stories, held lessons that could resonate with many. If you've ever found yourself questioning trust or navigating the murky waters of betrayal, you're not alone. Dive deeper into the world of cheating audio stories and explore the raw emotions and complex relationships that unfold in these narratives. Discover a collection of audio stories of infidelity that shed light on the heart-wrenching decisions and transformative moments faced by those in similar situations. Join the conversation on platforms like Reddit, where Reddit cheating stories reveal the real-life experiences of individuals grappling with infidelity. Share your thoughts, your stories, and your healing process. Don't let your experience go unheard. Embrace the power of storytelling and connect with others who understand. Your voice matters, let it be part of the dialogue. Click now to listen, share, and find solace in the stories that unite us all.